There's a point in the night where the pace you carried through the day begins to loosen in ways you don't immediately recognize. It doesn't stop all at once. It doesn't fall away sharply. It just softens its grip on your awareness, almost shyly, until you notice that you're no longer being pulled in the same direction you were earlier. The shift is quiet, but it changes the entire texture of your mind. The world outside slows first, and then the mind follows slightly behind, as if it waited to see if the stillness was real before allowing itself to match it. As this slow settling begins, you may sense a kind of spaciousness you didn't have access to before. Not an emptiness, not a clearing out, but something more subtle, a loosening of the mental clusters that stay tight throughout the day. Without anything demanding your attention, those clusters start to separate a little, giving you room to recognize how much tension was hidden under the speed of everything you had to move through. It's not relief. It's not release. It's simply the mind returning to a pace that fits it better than the one it had to maintain earlier. The absence of rush creates a softer kind of presence. It isn't deep. It isn't focused. It isn't intentional. It's the kind of presence that exists because there's finally enough quiet for it to appear on its own. You don't reach for it. You don't shift toward it. You only realize it's there when your thoughts stop tripping over one another and begin drifting at a gentler rhythm. The edges of your awareness smooth out, losing the sharpness they held when you were pushing through tasks or conversations or obligations. The night smooths them down without effort. In this slower internal space, thoughts no longer race to fill the gaps. They don't try to complete themselves. They don't form in lines or sequences. They show up softly, in partial shapes, sometimes just as impressions. You recognize them without needing to grasp them. They hover for a moment, then fade before they ever become something you could label. And that's what makes this pace different. It allows thoughts to exist without turning into anything. There's a simple kind of clarity in noticing how different your mind feels when it isn't bracing against the next thing. During the day, you might not realize how much your inner rhythm gets sped up by the world around you. Your mind shifts to match the pace of what it has to respond to. But at night, especially when things slow this much, the mind finally returns to its own tempo, a tempo that's lighter, slower, and less linear than you remember. The first sign of that return is usually a sense of distance from the momentum you carried earlier. Not separation exactly, but a gentle drift away from the urgency woven into the daytime hours. It feels like stepping out of a conversation that kept going long after you stopped contributing to it. The trace of motion is there, but it isn't tugging at you anymore. What remains is a fading echo of busyness that dissolves as soon as you stop leaning into it. As the night deepens, another layer of quiet settles into the mind, the layer that reveals how many thoughts were hidden, not because they were suppressed, but because the day was simply too fast for them to exist. When the pace drops, those thoughts rise slowly, as if they were waiting for permission to come forward. They aren't heavy, they aren't emotional, and they don't demand anything from you. They're just the softer residue of things you passed through earlier without noticing. In this softened state, awareness widens without pushing outward. It becomes broad without becoming alert, open without becoming searching. It feels more like drifting than observing. You're not scanning your thoughts, and you're not examining them. You're just existing near them, close enough to sense their outlines, but far enough not to feel pulled into them. The distance is gentle, almost weightless. The quiet of this moment doesn't silence the mind. It just lowers the volume enough for you to hear the undercurrent that was always there beneath the noise. That undercurrent is made of small recognitions, the things your mind noticed throughout the day, but didn't have the bandwidth to process. They come back now in light forms, no longer competing with anything. You're not revisiting them. You're not thinking about them. You're only seeing the faint marks they left behind. As the pace slows further, something else appears, a subtle alignment between your awareness and your thoughts. During the day, they often run at different speeds. At night, in moments like this, they fall into the same rhythm. Awareness becomes steady, and thought softens enough to move in parallel. That alignment isn't profound. It's just even a state where everything inside you matches the slow drift happening outside. Nothing in this moment asks for your involvement. Nothing requires analysis or meaning. The night isn't a backdrop for understanding. It's a pause that lets the mind breathe in its own way, at its own speed. You're not supposed to control anything here. You're not supposed to shape the experience. All that matters is the noticing, the recognition that the pace has dropped, and your mind for once isn't trying to catch up to anything. In that softened pace, you can feel the difference between a mind pushed by the day and a mind settling into the night. One is built around movement. The other is built around quiet presence. And when the night slows down enough, that presence becomes something you can finally feel, without effort, without intention, without needing it to be more than what it naturally is. As the night settles further, thought begins to take on a different texture, something slower, something less defined, something that doesn't try to follow the patterns it uses during the day. It's not that the mind becomes clearer or deeper, it simply becomes less occupied. And in that freed up space, certain kinds of thoughts begin to form that could never appear when everything moved too fast. They don't arrive with purpose. They don't arrive with context. They appear because the pace allows them to. These thoughts tend to be light, almost transparent. They don't carry weight or direction. They often emerge without a starting point, surfacing as small impressions that feel familiar, but not tied to anything specific. They show themselves in the same way something faint becomes visible only when the lighting dims, not suddenly, but gradually, as if it had been there the whole time, waiting for things to slow enough to be felt. During the day, the mind filters out anything that doesn't help you move forward. Thoughts that aren't immediately useful or relevant or urgent get swept aside. It's not suppression, it's prioritization. The world moves quickly, and the mind adapts to match that speed. But at night, when that speed drops, the thoughts that never made it to the surface finally have room to form. They come together quietly, without trying to complete themselves, without rushing to make sense. They exist only long enough for you to recognize their presence before they drift back into whatever quiet they came from. There's something distinct about these slower thoughts. They don't carry emotional signatures. They aren't tied to memory or worry or hope. They feel neutral, even soft. They don't try to shape your mood or pull you into reflection. They simply appear because the night has lowered enough barriers for them to do so. You're not thinking about them, you're noticing them. And that distinction changes the entire experience. The mind moves gently here. It doesn't chase after any one thought. It doesn't try to stabilize them or connect them. It lets them float at the pace they choose, which is often slower than anything you'd encounter during the day. This slower pace allows thoughts to retain a purity they lose when forced into structure. They remain in their simplest form, vague light, and quietly intact. As this continues, you may sense a shift in how you relate to your thoughts. Instead of meeting them with focus or evaluation, you meet them with something closer to passive awareness. It's not detachment. It's not engagement. It's a soft noticing, the kind that exists only when there's no demand to act or interpret. The thoughts don't belong to any timeline. They aren't part of anything unfolding. They're fragments that appear only because they're finally allowed to. In the slower minutes of night, thought stops trying to present itself as something coherent. It moves away from narrative and settles into something more like texture. A faint ripple, a small presence, a momentary shift in attention. It's not something you follow. It's something you sense. You don't hold it. It passes through you at a pace that doesn't disturb anything. There's an ease to this kind of mental movement. Everything feels unpressured. Even the transitions between thoughts feel soft, like there's no boundary separating one from the next. They drift into each other without merging, and then fade without leaving residue. When the world is slow enough, the mind stops tightening around experiences. It simply lets them pass in whatever shape they choose. These slow thoughts don't require context because they aren't trying to lead anywhere. They don't compete with each other. They don't jostle for attention. They come and go in the same way background sensations do, present noticeable but not intrusive. You're aware of them, but they never interrupt your sense of quiet. As more time passes in this slower pace, the boundary between noticing and drifting begins to blur. Awareness becomes lighter. It still exists, but without the density it has during the day. You feel your thoughts more as movements than as ideas. They shift, but without intention. They appear, but without message. They pass, but without closure. There's something effortless in that cycle, something calming without trying to be. What makes these thoughts unique is that they don't exist outside of moments like this. They can't. They depend on the night's lowered tempo to form. They depend on the absence of urgency. They depend on the quiet that only appears when everything else loses speed. They're shaped by the environment, by the time, by the stillness, and they fade the moment the pace rises again. You may notice that these thoughts don't provoke reactions. They don't ask for meaning. They don't feel incomplete. They just arrive in the exact shape they need to exist briefly before dissolving. And because they don't carry pressure, they don't leave anything behind for you to process. They simply become part of the quiet. This is the kind of thought life that only emerges in the slow minutes at night, not because the night is mystical or revealing, but because it finally matches the mind's quietest rhythm. It lets thoughts form in their softest state. It makes space for the things too gentle to survive the speed of the day. It offers a pace where thought becomes less of a tool and more of a presence. In these minutes, Everything moves with a softness that keeps you from tightening around anything. You're not trying to understand your thoughts. You're not trying to guide them. You're just letting them exist in the one environment where they're able to show themselves a night slow enough for them to form drift and disappear without ever needing to become more than what they are. When the world has already settled and your mind begins to match that gentler rhythm, something quiet unfolds inside you. Not an insight, not a realization, just a spaciousness that wasn't accessible before. It spreads without effort, the way a room feels bigger when the noise inside it fades. Nothing opens suddenly, nothing shifts dramatically. But the mind begins to expand in a soft, almost unnoticeable way, as if it were easing out of a tight frame it had been holding all day. This expansion isn't outward. It doesn't reach. It doesn't stretch into possibilities or move toward memory. It's a widening that happens inward in the part of the mind that rarely gets enough quiet to show its full shape. Throughout the day, that part remains compressed beneath layers of pace, interaction, and response. But here, in the slowness of night, it loosens. It decompresses. It unfolds just enough for you to sense how much space you've been carrying without ever using. You don't feel this expansion as a change in emotion. It's not calming, and it's not soothing. It's more like a shift in internal distance, as if the edges of your awareness move further away, leaving everything between them softer and more breathable. Nothing sharp remains. Nothing holds tightly. The mind thins out into something lighter, more spread, more naturally paced. Within this wider mental space, your thoughts behave differently. They no longer press forward the way they do when the day requires them to be efficient. They don't tighten into conclusions. They drift in shapes that feel broader, more relaxed. A thought may appear without anchoring itself to anything. Another may rise, slowly linger without reason, and then dissolve before it ever forms into language. They move like outlines, rather than statements, echoes, rather than ideas. You begin to sense the way your mind moves when it isn't pushed. It doesn't rush, and it doesn't pause. It takes on a continuous low-pressure motion, a kind of internal drift that feels directionless, but not lost. This drift isn't empty. It's filled with the lightest traces of unfinished impressions, unspoken recognitions, faint signals that never had room to surface earlier. They're not meaningful in any conventional sense. They're simply part of the mind's natural movement when it's given space to exist without expectation. In this softened expansion, awareness becomes less focused and more ambient. It doesn't select or categorize. It doesn't try to understand what appears. It just surrounds the movement of thought like a quiet field around something small and gentle. You're not observing from a distance, and you're not immersed inside your thoughts either. You're floating near them, carried by the same slow momentum they follow. There's something distinctly different about the way thought behaves in this kind of space. During the day, thoughts operate in sequence. One leads to another. Connections form quickly. Conclusions follow. But here, at this slower pace, the mind stops using its usual pathways. The thoughts that emerge aren't linking to anything. They aren't seeking resolution. They aren't moving toward a point. Instead, they're expanding sideways, thinning out into a kind of mental haze that's comfortable to drift in. This sideways expansion reveals how much of your inner world goes unnoticed when everything is fast. not because you miss it, but because speed compresses awareness. When the pace drops, the mind shows that it was always larger than the version it uses during the day. You can feel the contrast in how gently everything moves, how softly thoughts appear when they're not pressed by urgency. The quiet here doesn't isolate you, it simply gives you room. Room for thoughts to exist without task, room for awareness to exist without focus, room for your inner pace to reveal itself without needing to match anything outside of you. You don't need to hold on to this space to keep it open. It stays open naturally as long as the night remains unhurried. In this expanded mental landscape, you may notice that thoughts don't appear as intrusions. They feel more like soft currents passing through each one, shaping the space slightly before fading. They don't pull attention. They don't linger. They don't disturb anything. They just move across the surface of awareness, quiet enough to be sensed, but gentle enough to leave no trace behind. The openness allows a different kind of subtlety to show. You begin to feel the spaces between thoughts, the thin, weightless intervals that usually disappear beneath the noise of the day. Those intervals feel smooth, unbroken, almost fluid. They're not pauses. They're part of the drift. The mind isn't empty in these spaces. It's simply not producing anything. It's resting in its own texture. You don't need to guide this process or consciously stay with it. Expansion at this pace sustains itself. It happens because the night supports it, because nothing around you asks for attention, because there's no external momentum pulling your thoughts in any direction. The mind expands because it can, because it's no longer confined to the pace it had to maintain earlier. As this part of the night deepens, you begin to recognize how natural this state feels. Not extraordinary, not heightened, not insightful, just natural. This is the rhythm the mind returns to when it isn't being shaped by tasks or noise or urgency. It's the baseline underneath everything else. A wide, quiet space where thought doesn't need to form fully and awareness doesn't need to work. This expansion doesn't lead anywhere. It doesn't prepare you for anything. It doesn't build toward a feeling or a conclusion. It simply holds you in a slower rhythm, a softer openness, the kind that only appears when the night has slowed down long enough for your mind to remember how much room it actually has. There are small thoughts that move through you during the day so quietly that you barely sense them, the kinds that surface for half a second and disappear before you have time to register what they were. They aren't important, and they don't ask for anything. They're more like gentle, internal check-ins, small signals the mind sends to itself without expectation. But when the day is full, those signals get buried under movement conversation and the steady demand to react. They never get the chance to be seen. They slip through the cracks unnoticed. When the night slows down enough, these tiny check-ins begin to reappear. They don't come back all at once. They don't come back clearly. They rise in small pockets of awareness, each one briefly touching the surface before drifting away again. There's nothing dramatic about them. They don't shift your mood or break your focus. They simply become visible because there is finally enough quiet for their faint outlines to register. These micro thoughts don't arrive with context. They usually appear in the form of subtle acknowledgments, a small sense of something left unresolved, a brief awareness of a feeling you didn't linger on a momentary recognition of something you brushed past earlier. They're not emotional. They're not reflective. They feel closer to tiny status updates from the mind-soft movements that say, "This was here today," even if you didn't notice. During the day, your mind prioritizes motion over noticing. It adapts to the pace around you, responding to what needs attention and letting everything else fade into the background. Those tiny signals aren't lost. They're just placed aside. But at night, especially when the pace falls to its lowest point, the mind retrieves them in their quietest forms. You're not revisiting the day. You're simply sensing the residue of things that didn't have time to fully register. These check-ins don't belong to memory and don't belong to thought. There's something in between faint internal hints that only appear when nothing else is competing for space. They feel like the softest kind of recognition, the awareness that something existed earlier, even if you didn't process it at the time. They drift through the mind without forming stories, without creating patterns, without asking to be followed. As they surface, you begin to notice how much of your inner life is made of these small, easily missed signals. They don't carry meaning on their own. They don't lead anywhere. But together, they form a kind of background layer the mind is always generating beneath whatever you're doing. When the night slows, that layer becomes more visible, not because you're trying to access it, but because the mind finally has the bandwidth to show it. These tiny thoughts aren't revelations. They don't point to anything significant. They're more like soft taps on the edge of awareness, reminders that the mind notices more than you realize, even when you're too busy to engage with it. When the pace drops, those taps become perceptible. You feel the light pressure of their presence without needing to think about them. They appear as brief shifts in attention, small pulses of awareness that fade as quickly as they arrive. You may sense in these moments how gentle the mind can be when there's no need to react. These micro check-ins aren't warnings or reflections. They're neutral, purely informational. They're the mind acknowledging itself, taking stock in the lightest way possible. You're not meant to evaluate them or explore them. You simply notice them the same way you notice a slight change in temperature or a subtle shift in mood present, but not demanding. As the quiet deepens, these small thoughts begin to space themselves out, drifting at a slower rhythm than the flow of your usual thinking. They appear with more clarity, but not more urgency. The gaps between them become wider, smoother. In those gaps, you may feel a kind of low-level steadiness, the way awareness relaxes when it's not being pulled in any direction. The mind doesn't fill the silence. It doesn't expand or contract. It just lets these tiny signals arise and fall naturally. The interesting thing about these micro check-ins is that they don't carry the emotional marks they might have carried if you had noticed them earlier. During the day, a moment of discomfort or confusion might have been ignored or pushed aside. At night, that same moment returns without its weight. It shows itself as a soft, almost intangible trace, not the feeling itself, just the outline of it. This version is easier to notice because it doesn't require interpretation. It's simply the mind acknowledging something that passed through it. You may feel as if you're sensing the mind's background processing, but without the pressure or complexity usually attached to that idea. These check-ins are closer to gentle reminders that the mind records everything in some way, even the smallest impressions. At this pace, they don't ask to be understood. They just drift into awareness long enough to be recognized, then dissolve when they no longer need to be held. As the night maintains its slow rhythm, you settle into a kind of quiet coexistence with these small inner signals. They rise and fade without interrupting anything. They don't form patterns or stories. They don't accumulate. They appear independently, each one a brief moment of noticing that feels complete as soon as it arrives. The mind doesn't try to hold on to them. It simply acknowledges them in passing. In this softened state, you begin to understand how much of your inner landscape is made of these subtle movements, tiny, fleeting, often ignored. They only become visible when the world slows enough for you to sense them. And in sensing them, you begin to feel the gentler layers of your mind, the ones that exist beneath thought, beneath reflection, beneath anything structured at all. These layers reveal themselves only when the night is quiet enough, slow enough, and spacious enough for the smallest things to finally be felt. When the night reaches a point where everything feels less stretched, a quiet closeness begins forming inside you. Not an emotional closeness, not a reflective one, but something simpler, the sense that your thoughts are no longer standing at a distance. Throughout the day, there's space between you and whatever moves through your mind. That space isn't intentional. It's just the result of being pulled in multiple directions. Your awareness stays busy, your attention stays scattered, and the mind keeps a gap between noticing and sensing, so it can keep up with everything happening around you. But in the slower hours, that distance diminishes. You begin to feel your thoughts as if they're standing nearer than usual, not pressing into you, not asking for anything, just settling close enough to be recognized without effort. They arrive with a softness that makes them easy to approach, not because they're comforting, but because they're no longer wrapped in the noise that pushes them away during the day. What you feel is not depth, it's proximity. This closeness isn't heavy. It doesn't carry intensity. It feels more like the mind is no longer pushing itself forward to match the world, so the space it once created collapses gently inward. Thoughts appear at the same level as your awareness rather than behind it. They don't need to surface. They're already here. You meet them without reaching toward them. They enter your attention without crossing a distance to get there. The experience isn't dramatic. You may not even realize it's happening at first. It begins with a shift in how you sense your own mind, an ease, a settling, a lowering of the subtle friction that normally sits between you and your thoughts. There's no pull, no hesitation, no need to prepare yourself for whatever appears. Everything arrives in a natural, unforced way, as if your mind simply stepped closer to itself when the night grew quiet enough. When internal distance shortens your thoughts, don't become clearer. They don't become louder. What changes is the amount of effort you need to notice them. During the day, noticing requires attention, which requires energy, which requires focus. At night, in these slow minutes, noticing happens on its own. A thought enters your awareness without needing you to shift toward it. You register it without the usual cognitive steps. It's just there close enough to touch without touching. In this nearness, thought takes on a different texture, It feels smoother, lighter, less layered. It lacks the momentum it carries when you're busy. There is no push from behind it, no pressure to follow it, no urge to respond. It moves gently across your awareness, like something gliding past at a comfortable distance, and yet it feels more within reach than anything you sensed earlier in the day. You may begin to realize that the mind maintains distance not to hide anything, but to keep you functional in a world that moves quickly. That distance shrinks only when the pace around you drops low enough for the mind to stop bracing itself. Once the tension dissolves, thoughts take their natural place beside your awareness, not behind it. They exist closer because they no longer need to navigate the layers of speed that come with daytime thinking. In this softened closeness, even neutral thoughts feel easier to inhabit. Their outlines show without the distortion created by stress or urgency. They appear in a gentle form, not sharper, not deeper, just more reachable. You recognize them without analysis. You sense them without following them. You understand their presence without translating them into anything. Their closeness makes them easier to accept simply as part of the moment. Sometimes this internal proximity reveals how scattered the day actually was. You feel the contrast between the mind you used to move through the world and the mind that exists beneath that motion. But the contrast isn't jarring. It's quiet. It's the difference between hearing something from across a room and hearing it from a few steps away. The message is the same, but the experience of receiving it changes. The mind becomes more even in this state. There's no lag between awareness and thought. They move at the same pace, in the same tone, without one overwhelming the other. This alignment makes thoughts feel more integrated, as if they belong to the same space you occupy, rather than floating somewhere else waiting to be noticed. The closeness also makes everything feel softer. Even the slightest thought feels less like an interruption and more like a natural part of the environment inside you. When internal distance shortens far enough, the sense of separation between you and your thoughts becomes less defined. Not in a way that blurs identity or overwhelms you, but in a way that removes barriers. There's no need to guard, no need to filter, no need to evaluate. You coexist with your thoughts as they are at their gentlest without expecting anything from them. The night's quiet pace creates the perfect conditions for this coexistence to occur. In these slow moments, you might notice how comfortable that closeness feels. Not comforting comfortable. It asks nothing of you. It requires no adjustment. It simply reveals how naturally the mind settles when it doesn't have to create distance to keep functioning. The closeness allows you to sense your thoughts as part of the moment rather than something separate from it. It's a subtle shift, but it changes the entire feel of your inner landscape. As the night continues, its steady, unhurried rhythm, this closeness deepens without tightening. Thoughts remain near, but light present, but unobtrusive. There is no tension in holding them. There is no pressure in sensing them. You exist next to them, with the same ease you exist in quiet spaces outside yourself. The distance is gone, and all that remains is a soft, natural nearness, the kind that only appears when the world is slow enough for the mind to return to itself. There are movements inside the mind that never finish themselves during the day. They start pause shift aside and disappear beneath whatever you needed to focus on next. They aren't unresolved issues or emotional weights. They're simply the beginnings of thoughts, early signals, half-formed impressions, gentle mental motions that didn't have time to complete their arc. When the pace is fast, these fragments dissolve before they become anything recognizable. They fall away unnoticed. But at night, when the world has slowed to its quietest pace, those unfinished movements begin returning in a different form. Not as memories, not as reflections, but as soft echoes. They don't pick up where they left off. They don't continue their earlier trajectory. They reappear as lighter versions of themselves, stripped of urgency, stripped of context, stripped of the momentum that once surrounded them. In the absence of pressure, they become quiet enough to see. These returning fragments aren't trying to tell you something. They don't arrive with meaning or direction. They simply drift back because there is finally enough space for them to exist without being pushed aside. They rise slowly, almost cautiously, as if testing whether the environment is gentle enough to hold them. Their tone is soft, almost weightless, the kind of presence that wouldn't survive even a moment of daytime pace. You may not recognize them as leftovers from earlier hours. They don't feel like recollection. They feel more like a mental hum that was interrupted and is now finishing its final vibration. A thought you barely registered, a feeling you brushed past, an impression that never had room to settle. These pieces come back not to complete themselves, but to exist in their simplest, least demanding form. As they surface, the mind begins to reveal how much it carries without processing. Not in the sense of emotional backlog, but in the sense of gentle mental motion, the kind that doesn't require attention, yet still leaves faint traces. During the day, those traces blur into noise. At night, they return as clear but feather-light outlines. They take up almost no space, but they are undeniably present. These unfinished movements behave differently here. They drift without seeking closure. They appear without needing definition. They float in the same way a soft intention might present, but not committed to becoming anything. They might last only a moment before dissolving again, or they might hover near awareness long enough for you to sense the full shape they never had time to form earlier. Either way, they don't ask to be held. They simply move at the pace the night allows. In this slower environment, awareness doesn't grip these fragments the way it might during moments of stress. It stays loose, gentle, non-reactive. A fragment rises. You notice its shape. It dissolves. Another follows. You sense its texture. It fades. There's no pull to interpret them, no momentum pushing them into a chain of thoughts. They remain separate, independent, floating freely in the soft space nighttime creates. Sometimes these unfinished movements return with trace elements of the day's tone, not the content, just the rhythm that surrounded them. A subtle impression of urgency that no longer has urgency. A faint echo of distraction that no longer distracts. A tiny residue of focus that no longer needs to land anywhere. These remnants feel distant, almost abstracted from their source. Without the pressure of the original moment, they lose their sharpness and become almost tender. The mind often tries to resolve things when the day is active, tying together loose threads automatically to keep itself organized. But at night, that system goes quiet. It stops trying to stitch things together. It stops trying to complete circuits. The unfinished movements that return now aren't routed toward resolution. They're allowed to remain incomplete, which is their most natural state. They don't require structure. They don't require meaning. They simply require room, and the night provides it. As these fragments drift through awareness, you may notice how gentle their presence feels. They don't interrupt. They don't disturb. They move with the same softness as the quiet surrounding them. The mind accommodates them easily, letting them pass like small waves that never crest. Each one arrives with its own subtle tone. A faint sense of this existed earlier, but without the weight the moment originally carried. There's something strangely comforting in sensing how little these unfinished movements truly demand. When they return, they reveal that most of what the mind carries is lighter than it appears. Its weight during the day comes from speed, not substance. When the speed is gone, the fragments lose their intensity. They reveal themselves as simple, incomplete impressions that drift through awareness smoothly and without friction. You might feel, in these moments, that the mind is exhaling parts of the day that never had a chance to surface. Not releasing them, not letting go, but simply allowing them to finish whatever faint trace of motion they started. Their return is unforced, natural, a quiet completion of something that was never fully formed. As the night deepens, these unfinished movements slow even further. Their drift becomes softer, subtler. They appear farther apart, as if each one needs less time to be sensed. Eventually, they no longer feel like fragments at all. They become part of the gentle undercurrent that defines the mind. At this hour, a soft drifting flow, made of things that didn't need to be completed, only acknowledged as they passed. And when that flow settles into its lowest rhythm, the mind feels quieter, not because anything was resolved, but because everything unfinished has been allowed to exist without pressure. In this space, the mind holds nothing tightly, not even its own remnants. It simply moves with the night's slow drift, letting each return happen in the softest way possible. There's a way the mind filters itself during the day that you rarely notice while it's happening. It trims sorts and redirects thoughts before they ever reach awareness, shaping what rises to the surface so you can keep moving at the pace the world demands. Most of those filters are subtle, small separations that keep you from feeling overwhelmed, small adjustments that keep thought organized enough to function. They aren't protective in an emotional sense. They're practical. They keep you aligned with motion. They keep you efficient. But when the night slows far enough, those filters begin to thin out. Not collapse, just soften. They lose their edge, their sharpness, their purpose. What they normally hold back or smooth over starts to appear in its original form, unprocessed, unshaped. The mind without its daytime filters feels different. Not raw, not exposed, but unlayered. What rises now reaches you without the usual refinement. Thought returns to its most natural state. This unfiltered state isn't chaotic. It doesn't rush in. It doesn't flood you. It feels more like a gentle unveiling, the mind showing itself without adjusting for your pace, your tasks, or the pressures you carried earlier. You aren't overwhelmed because nothing pushes forward. Thoughts appear the way they naturally form, soft at the edges, loose in structure, not trying to complete themselves. You experience them directly without the usual gap created by mental organization. In these moments, the mind behaves as though it no longer needs to protect its own bandwidth. Without filters, the small variations in tone movement and shape of thought become visible. You can sense the beginnings of ideas, the slight curve of an impression, the delicate shift of an awareness that would normally be sanded down by the rush of the day. It's not clarity, it's simplicity. What you're sensing is thought before it becomes thought. During the day, filters remove this simplicity because it would slow you down. A mind that shows everything it generates can't move quickly. It can't prioritize. It can't maintain the sharp pacing needed to function in a fast environment. But at night, when that environment quiets, the mind has no reason to refine itself. It can reveal even the faintest mental activity without worrying about efficiency. Every small internal movement is allowed to exist as it is. You might notice that your thoughts now feel closer to sensations than to ideas. They don't build or connect, they drift. They come in light pulses, each carrying only enough form to be recognized. There is no storyline, no sequence, no intention. This is the mind without its usual structure, not empty, but open. Not silent, but unburdened. What appears in this openness isn't meant to guide you anywhere. It simply reflects how the mind operates when it's not being shaped by speed. This shift into unfiltered awareness brings with it a softness that touches everything your mind produces. Even the thoughts that might have sounded sharp earlier now feel rounded, quiet, almost tender, not because their content changed, but because their edges are no longer honed for action. The mind isn't preparing them for anything. It isn't shaping them to fit into conversations or choices or reactions. It's letting them exist as raw outlines, unrefined and gentle. As you sense these unfiltered thoughts, you may realize how rarely you experience them in this natural form. Most of the time, you meet thought after it's been shaped, organized, and directed. But here, in the night's slow pace, you encounter the earliest phase the moment a thought begins to form, before it knows what it wants to be. That moment is soft, fleeting, delicate enough that even slight noise would dissolve it. There's a quiet intimacy in sensing thought at this level. Not emotional intimacy, but proximity to the inner mechanics of your mind. You're not looking into yourself. You're watching the small movements that usually stay hidden behind filters. These movements aren't meaningful in themselves. They're simply honest. They show how your mind generates content before deciding what to do with it, revealing a kind of transparency that doesn't exist during the day. Without filters, the mind also stops adjusting thought for tone. A thought might rise without being softened or sharpened to fit your emotional state. It doesn't try to match your mood or align with expectations. It appears neutrally, freely. This neutrality creates a gentleness that feels different from calmness. Calmness is an effect. This is a default. The mind isn't seeking stillness. It's simply not manufacturing structure. Because nothing is filtered, everything feels slightly closer to your awareness. Not intrusive, not loud, just near. The proximity doesn't overwhelm because the thoughts themselves are gentle. They don't ask for attention. They don't linger unless the environment allows them to. They move lightly, fading as easily as they appear. As the night continues, you start to feel as though your awareness and your thoughts are sitting at the same level without hierarchy. Normally, awareness stands above filtering and organizing. But here, they coexist evenly. A thought appears, and awareness meets it at eye level. There's no distance, no evaluation, just presence. In this unfiltered state, the mind doesn't try to be useful. It doesn't try to process or interpret or guide. It simply produces these raw, gentle movements because that's what it does when left alone. You're witnessing the baseline layer of your thinking, not the structured version, but the original texture beneath it. And because the night is slow enough to hold it, that texture becomes something you can finally sense without the usual interference. As you drift further into this space, the filters thin almost completely. Thought becomes a quiet stream of beginnings, soft, unhurried, unpolished. It's not insight. It's not revelation. It's the mind showing you the simplest version of itself, the version that exists before anything else shapes it. And in the slow, wide quiet of the night, that simplicity feels like the most natural thing in the world. There is a kind of space that forms around your thoughts when the night is slow enough. It doesn't feel like silence, and it doesn't feel like emptiness. It feels more like a soft buffer, a quiet margin that gives each thought just enough room to exist without touching anything else. During the day, thoughts sit close together. They overlap, bump into one another, merge, tangle, and compete for attention. Pace compresses them. Noise compresses them. Responsibility compresses them. There's no space for separation, only motion. But in these slower hours, the spacing returns. A thought appears, and instead of being crowded immediately by another, it settles into an open field inside the mind. There's a pause around it, not intentional, not created by focus, just naturally present. The edges of the thought don't spill. They stay contained, suspended in a soft neutrality that holds them gently. The mind isn't pushing, the thought isn't rushing, and the surrounding quiet makes the entire experience feel almost weightless. This space around thought changes how you sense it. You feel the outline more than the content. You feel its presence rather than its shape. It becomes less about what the thought is and more about how lightly it sits within you. With room around it, the thought has no reason to sharpen or intensify. It doesn't need to compete or assert itself. It hovers in a balanced state, fully noticeable but not pressing. You may begin to sense that this space isn't something new. It has always been part of your mind. It just rarely has the conditions to appear. The day compresses everything until the gaps vanish. The night, when slow enough, allows those gaps to reform. In them, your thoughts breathe differently. They stretch out gently, gaining width rather than height. And this width creates a feeling of softness that no daytime thought ever quite manages. As this space opens, awareness shifts too. It becomes less targeted. It doesn't lock onto a thought or follow its movement. It settles into the area around the thought, instead an ambient kind of attention that surrounds rather than penetrates. This surrounding awareness allows the thought to exist without becoming something you have to engage with. It can be present without becoming important, known without being examined. When this spacing becomes consistent, the entire texture of your inner world changes. There is no clutter, no rush, no sense of thoughts piling on top of each other. Everything has room. Even when multiple thoughts drift in, they don't crowd. They appear separately, each with its own quiet perimeter. They don't merge or collapse into narrative. They stay distinct, yet gentle, like soft signals drifting across open mental air. Sometimes that space feels even more noticeable than the thoughts themselves. You sense the emptiness between your thoughts as clearly as you sense the thoughts. That emptiness isn't silence. It has its own presence, a low, steady tone that carries the mind from one moment of noticing to the next. It smooths the transitions. It softens the rises and falls. It keeps everything at the same calm altitude. This space also changes the emotional tone of your thoughts. With room around them, they lose their sharpness. Even thoughts that might have felt tense earlier become quieter here. Not because they have been resolved, but because the spacing removes the pressure that tightens them. A tense thought needs crowding to stay tense. Given space, it loosens. The edges drop. The intensity drains. What remains is only the faint trace of what it once carried. You don't need to do anything to create this effect. You don't need to breathe differently or clear your mind. The spacing isn't something you cause. It is something the night does something the lack of external movement allows. Your thoughts simply fall into the rhythm the environment provides. And when that environment is soft, slow, and unhurried, the spacing appears naturally. As you linger in this soft spacing state, you may notice how differently the mind feels when it's not forced to maintain continuity. During the day, thoughts form in chains. One leads to another. But here, the chains dissolve. Thoughts appear singly, briefly, freely. Their independence is part of the spacing. They don't require connection. They don't require follow-up. They don't require meaning. They exist as single points drifting through a wide field, appearing and fading without creating pathways. This independence gives you a different sense of your own mind. It shows you how much space actually exists inside you when nothing is pushing against it. It shows you how gentle the mind can be when it isn't compressed. It shows you how lightly thoughts can move when they aren't trying to get somewhere. That spaciousness isn't a technique. It's a natural state the mind falls into when allowed. As the night deepens, that space becomes even softer. Thoughts drift more slowly. The gaps widen. You begin to feel the spacing as a continuous presence, an open field that holds everything without effort. There is no boundary to this field, no structure, no requirement. It simply exists, and your thoughts move within it with the same softness the night uses to move through you. In this state, nothing presses inward. Nothing pushes outward. The mind becomes a wide, dim landscape where every thought has room to appear and disappear without disturbing anything else. The space around them is what defines them, a gentle, quiet perimeter that gives each one its moment before it fades into the night's slow rhythm once again. There is a moment in the night when noticing stops feeling like something you do and becomes something that simply happens. It isn't effortful, and it isn't deliberate. It unfolds on its own, carried by the slowing inside you. The mind, no longer shaped by the day's pace, begins to reveal its smaller details, subtle shifts, faint impressions, brief variations in tone that would have gone unseen in any faster environment. You don't sharpen your attention to find them. You just begin to sense them because the quiet finally makes space for it. What makes noticing easier in these hours isn't heightened awareness. It's lowered resistance. During the day, your awareness is full of movement, focus switching, processing, reacting, anticipating. There's no bandwidth left for the gentler details of your own mind. But when everything loses speed, the pressure to track or analyze disappears, and attention relaxes into something broader, softer, more receptive. It meets whatever arises without dividing itself. In this softened state, even the smallest internal shifts become visible. A thought drifts in from nowhere, and instead of slipping past you, it lingers just long enough to be sensed. A faint trace of an earlier feeling rises, but not in a way that pulls you backward, more like a soft reminder of something that passed through you without staying. These impressions don't need your focus. They arrive with their own clarity, the kind that doesn't demand interpretation. Noticing becomes less like observing and more like floating beside your thoughts as they move at a pace slow enough to match your own. You're not directing attention. You're not following anything. Awareness rests in a neutral position, watching gently as thought moves in and out of its field. There's no friction in the movement. Nothing catches. Nothing sticks. Everything slides through quietly. This quiet form of noticing reveals details that normally sit beneath the surface. You begin to sense the slight change in tone as one thought fades and another appears. You notice the tiny pauses between them, pauses not filled with silence, but with a kind of soft presence. You feel the gentle shift in mental weight when a thought begins to form, not heavy, just enough to register. All of these movements are so subtle they require a pace like this to appear at all. In this state, noticing doesn't have a goal. It's not meant to bring understanding or insight. It simply reflects the natural rhythm of a mind that has slowed enough for you to experience its faintest motions. You sense things not because you're trying to be mindful, but because the environment inside you has quieted to a point where noticing is the path of least resistance. Awareness no longer has anywhere else to go. You may realize that your attention feels softer, almost diffused. It doesn't concentrate sharply on any one thought. It expands around them, instead, creating a gentle field in which each thought appears more clearly than it would under sharper focus. This softness is what makes noticing feel effortless. It holds thought lightly, giving you access to its shape without drawing you into it. As the night settles even further, the quality of noticing becomes smoother. You feel less distinction between the act of noticing and what is being noticed. A thought arises and is recognized in the same breath without separation. It doesn't feel like attention moves toward the thought. It feels like the thought appears directly within awareness, as if both occupy the same space. This ease allows for a different kind of clarity, not sharp, not bright, but consistent. The clarity that comes from being able to sense things at their lowest volume, a slight pulse of memory, a passing idea with no intention behind it, a shift in mood so light it barely registers. All of these become perceptible now, not because they grew stronger, but because the quiet around them grew wider. Noticing also becomes symmetrical. You're not better at noticing big or small thoughts. Everything is recognized at the same level of softness. A vague impression receives the same gentle attention as a clearer thought. A fleeting feeling is sensed with the same neutrality as a neutral mental drift. This symmetry removes bias. Nothing feels emphasized. Nothing feels minimized. Everything is allowed to appear with equal gentleness. You might begin to recognize how much of your inner world exists in shades and half-formed shapes. These shapes don't usually stay long enough to be acknowledged. But here, they linger just enough to be felt, and once felt, They slip away again without leaving interpretation behind. This is noticing without attachment, without follow through, without the weight of meaning. The more the night slows, the smoother this process becomes. The mind stops producing abrupt shifts. Transitions soften. The gaps between thoughts stretch out slightly, making each arrival easier to sense. This rhythm creates an internal environment where noticing feels like drifting along a slow current, steady, unforced, uninterrupted. Eventually, noticing becomes so natural that it blends into the background of your awareness. You no longer distinguish between the thought and the recognition of the thought. They coexist quietly, each one appearing with the same softness, the same ease, the same lack of urgency. The night holds everything in a lowered tone, and in that tone, the mind reveals itself in the gentlest details. It has details you can only sense when the world around you has slowed enough for the smallest things to finally rise into view. There is a kind of inner landscape that only becomes visible when everything inside you drops to its lowest volume. It isn't silence, and it isn't emptiness. It's more like a terrain made of muted contours, the soft outlines of thoughts, the faint shifts in tone, the gentle textures of awareness that stay hidden beneath daytime noise. You don't discover this landscape by looking for it. You fall into it naturally when the pace of the night becomes slow enough to reveal what's been there all along. In this low-volume state, the mind doesn't broadcast anything. It doesn't highlight, emphasize, or insist. Everything moves in quiet layers, each one so subtle that it needs a quiet environment to be felt. A thought rises not with clarity, but with softness, like a shape that's been blurred around the edges. You sense it without needing to understand it. It's present without being pronounced. Even the way it fades feels light, not disappearing, just receding into the wider quiet around it. What stands out most in this landscape is how little intensity anything carries. Even the thoughts that would normally hold tension or urgency feel flattened here, as if stripped of their emotional charge. They don't arrive with force. They arrive with tone small, low-frequency impressions that you register not through interpretation, but through the softest form of awareness. You're not thinking about them. You're brushing against them. This muted tone affects everything your mind produces. Sensations become soft echoes. Memories turn into faint outlines instead of vivid scenes. Anticipations lose their pull. Even internal dialogues thin out until they feel like distant murmurs rather than coherent thoughts. The mind isn't shutting down. It's simply moving at such a low energy level that nothing reaches the volume it would need to become a distraction. As you drift deeper into this landscape, you start to sense the layering of your inner world in a new way. Instead of thoughts stacking on top of one another, they settle side by side, flat and gentle, like thin sheets arranged without friction. Each one is separate, but harmonious with the next. There's no struggle for attention, no collision between mental movements. Everything blends into a soft rhythm that feels consistent and calm. This low-volume environment brings a certain steadiness. You may notice that your internal reactions slow as well. A thought that might have stirred something earlier barely brushes the surface now. Feelings pass as mild variations rather than waves. Your mind doesn't amplify or suppress anything. It lets everything exist at the same muted intensity, giving you a balanced view of your inner landscape without highs or lows. Awareness itself changes texture here. It becomes more diffused, less pointed. It doesn't focus narrowly on what appears. It surrounds your thoughts, holding them in a gentle field rather than shining a spotlight on them. That field allows thoughts to remain soft. Anything sharp would feel out of place in this environment. The mind instinctively lowers the edges of thought to match the quiet it's drifting through. At this volume, even transitions feel different. Instead of thoughts shifting sharply from one to another, they glide across your awareness like smooth gradients. One fades as the next begins, creating a continuous flow with no jolts or breaks. You sense the blending more than the boundaries. It feels seamless, consistent, unhurried. One of the most distinct qualities of this inner landscape is how spacious it feels, despite being filled with thought. The low volume creates room within each thought, a kind of inner airiness that keeps everything from feeling crowded. Even when several impressions appear, at once they remain gentle enough not to overlap in a way that overwhelms. They coexist quietly, each one barely touching the next. This spaciousness also shifts your relationship with your thoughts. You don't lean toward them, and you don't recoil from them. You simply share space with them. They don't demand anything from you. They don't create friction. They exist at the same steady tone, allowing you to sense them without feeling pulled. It's one of the few times when awareness and thought meet without hierarchy, without tension, without pressure. As the night deepens and the mind settles further, this low-volume landscape becomes even more defined. Thoughts thin out until they feel almost like shadows of themselves, not diminished, but softened to the point where only their gentlest qualities remain. A hint of movement, a faint shift, a subtle warm or cool tone. Nothing sharp, nothing heavy, nothing loud. Eventually, you may reach a point where the landscape feels continuous, like a single quiet field rather than a series of separate thoughts. Everything moves within that field at the same pace, with the same softness, guided by the same quiet rhythm the night provides. In this field, nothing needs to be resolved or understood. Everything simply exists in its lowest, calmest tone, a tone that only appears when the world is slow enough for your mind to match it. And as long as that tone holds, the landscape remains open wide and gentle, a place where thought no longer competes with anything, not even itself. There's a point in the night when urgency simply falls away. Not because anything has been resolved, and not because the mind has reached clarity, but because the conditions for urgency no longer exist. The pace that fuels it is gone. The pressure that sustains it has dissolved. What remains is a mind that no longer feels the need to prepare for the next moment, the next task, the next movement. Everything that usually pulls you forward goes quiet, and the space around you steadies into something almost weightless. In this state, the mind stops leaning. During the day, it leans constantly toward decisions, toward reactions, toward responsibilities, toward whatever might happen next. That leaning creates a subtle tension, a sense of readiness that keeps your thoughts slightly ahead of themselves. But when the night slows to its lowest rhythm, that forward tilt disappears. The mind returns to a more level position, no longer anticipating anything, no longer adjusting its posture for what might come. Without urgency, thought begins to move differently. There's no push behind it, no pull ahead of it. It drifts the way something would drift if left in still air, slow light without direction. Thoughts don't try to form conclusions. They don't try to connect. They appear at their own pace, shaped only by the quiet that surrounds them. Even the ones that carried momentum earlier lose their force here. What once felt like movement now feels like a faint suggestion, a trace more than a trajectory. You may notice, as this shift deepens, that the mind stops producing the sense of should. There is no subtle pressure to evaluate a thought, no impulse to organize it, no internal urge to respond. The machinery that prioritizes and sorts falls quiet. The mind simply doesn't see a reason to activate it. At this pace, everything loses the parts that usually demand action. A thought is just a thought, not a problem, not a prompt, not a step toward anything. The absence of urgency also changes the body-like sensations of awareness, though not in a physical way. It's more like a settling, a lowering of some internal pitch that leaves the mind feeling even and smooth. You sense fewer spikes in attention. You feel fewer fluctuations between focus and distraction. Awareness holds a single steady tone that makes it easier for thoughts to pass through without disturbing anything. This steadiness reveals how much urgency distorts your perception during the day. Under pressure, thoughts feel heavier, sharper, more defined. They carry weight because the mind is bracing against time. But here, without time pressing against you, the same thoughts appear softer. Their shape loosens. Their edges blur. They no longer arrive as demands, only as movements. This change also affects how long thoughts stay. Urgency makes thoughts cling. It causes them to hook into your awareness, insisting on resolution. But in this lowered state, nothing hooks. A thought rises, touches the surface briefly, then dissolves, without leaving tension behind. Even thoughts that would normally escalate concerns, planning old conversations, lose their structure here. They flatten into something neutral, a kind of mental vapor that doesn't linger. In this environment, the mind becomes more honest with itself. Without urgency, it has no reason to amplify anything. It doesn't exaggerate. It doesn't dramatize. It doesn't turn small things into large ones. Everything stays at its natural size, which is often smaller, lighter, and quieter than it felt before. You experience your mind without the distortion of speed. As this state continues, you start to sense a different kind of presence, not alertness, not mindfulness, but something closer to a gentle being with. You sit next to your thoughts, rather than inside them. You don't push them away, and you don't engage. You share space with them. And in that shared space, neither you nor the thoughts are trying to move. The night holds both of you still enough to see the difference between movement and rest. This lack of urgency also brings a soft openness. You're not preparing for anything. You're not closing anything off. The mind becomes more receptive simply because it's not guarding itself. But this receptivity isn't deep or searching. It's neutral. It's the quiet readiness that appears when nothing is required of you. Awareness spreads because there's nothing to narrow it. Eventually, you might notice that even time feels different. Not slower, not frozen, just less present. You're not measuring moments. You're not anticipating what comes next. You're not holding on to what just passed. The mind exists in a kind of suspended state where moments feel continuous rather than sequential. Without urgency, time loses its sharp edges. In this softened field, You sense the mind's natural pace, a pace that moves gently, that doesn't force, that doesn't chase. You may even recognize that this is the pace your mind would prefer all along if the world allowed it. It's the baseline beneath everything else. When urgency is removed, the mind doesn't sink or rise. It settles. It finds the level where it doesn't have to resist anything. As the night holds this level, you remain in a state where thought drifts, awareness steadies, and nothing inside you pushes forward. It isn't stagnation. It's quiet balance, a mind without urgency, moving at the only speed that feels like its own. There is a kind of movement the mind makes at night that doesn't point anywhere, a drifting motion, steady and unhurried, that feels less like thinking and more like something passing through you on its way to nowhere in particular. It isn't wandering, and it isn't searching. It's simply the way thought behaves when it's free from direction. During the day, every thought has a place to go. Even idle thinking gravitates toward tasks, reactions, or patterns. But here, in the deep quiet of the night, thoughts lose their need for destinations. They move because that is their natural state when nothing is steering them. This directionless movement feels different from the drift you experience when you're tired or unfocused. It has a coherence to it, even though it leads nowhere. The mind isn't dissolving. It isn't collapsing. It's just no longer shaping thought into paths. What appears moves gently, lightly, as if carried by a current too subtle to feel. You notice it only because you're finally slow enough to sense that movement at all, the soft sweep of an impression, the brief arrival of a half-formed idea, the quiet fading that follows. The absence of direction doesn't create emptiness. Thoughts still appear, but their energy changes. Instead of pushing forward or pulling you with them, they drift sideways, upward, downward motions that have no goal and no tension behind them. They feel like small, shifting patterns on the surface of awareness, none more important than the next. You're not following them, and they're not trying to lead. They coexist with you, each one appearing at the exact pace the night allows. This kind of drifting makes you aware of how much effort your mind usually puts into structure. Even the lightest daydream tends to form loops or arcs, building towards some small internal conclusion. But here none of that exists. Thought appears without beginning, moves without sequence, and fades without closure. It doesn't form stories or chains. It doesn't seek to resolve anything. It moves because movement is simply what thought does when freed from the pressure to be useful. As you drift with these thoughts, you may notice that awareness becomes more horizontal. There is no verticality, no rise toward insight, no drop into reflection. Everything happens on a single plane, smooth and quiet. Thoughts float across that plane like soft ripples, barely shifting the surface. They're not loud enough to disrupt anything and not solid enough to take shape. They pass through you, but they don't leave marks. Sometimes this drift feels almost like a quiet rebalancing, not an emotional one, a structural one. The mind adjusts itself to the slowed rhythm of the night, letting old momentum drain away and new movement emerge without intention. You sense the difference between thought that is moving because it must and thought that moves because it can. The latter is lighter, gentler, almost airy. This state also reveals that much of what you consider thinking during the day is actually the mind navigating direction. It's responding, anticipating, tracking. But when direction drops out, you're left with a much simpler motion, a kind of internal sway that carries no message. It's the mind in its baseline form, unfiltered and unpurposed, drifting along just to exist. The lack of direction removes the friction you normally feel between one thought and the next. Instead of transitioning abruptly or colliding thoughts, transition smoothly, almost imperceptibly. One dissolves as another forms, but they don't link together. They share space the way soft sounds blend in a quiet room. You're aware of each as it appears, but none of them tugs at you. They come forward, recede, and leave nothing behind that needs sorting. In these moments, noticing becomes almost passive. You aren't paying attention in the deliberate sense. Awareness simply settles near whatever is passing through. Thought moves, and you move with it without meaning to. It's a state where involvement becomes effortless, not because you're deeply engaged, but because there's nothing to push against. The mind is gently active, quietly alive, drifting at the pace of the surrounding night. This directionless drift often reveals how little strain the mind feels when it isn't being driven. Without a goal, thought loses the weight of expectation. It doesn't need to be coherent or productive or relevant. It doesn't need to reach an end. It doesn't need to create anything. It just needs room. And when the night slows down enough, that room appears naturally wide, soft, unbounded. As the drift continues, you may notice that your sense of self within the mind shifts slightly. You're not the thinker. You're the space where thinking happens. The drifting thoughts are movements inside that space, not messages directed toward you. They don't require your involvement. They're simply occurrences like faint waves inside a quiet field. You can sense them without holding them. Eventually, the entire process becomes so smooth that the boundary between thoughts and the quiet they move through feels thin. The drift blends with the stillness. The movements become subtle enough to almost disappear, though they never fully stop. They just lose direction, lose intention, lose tension. All that remains is a soft, continuous motion that belongs wholly to the rhythm of the night. And in that rhythm, thought becomes nothing more than gentle movement, slow, unhurried, without destination, exactly the shape it takes when the world has finally slowed down enough for it to return to its simplest form. There is a certain weight that appears only when the night is slow enough, a weight that isn't heavy, isn't emotional, and isn't tied to anything specific. It's the soft weight of simple awareness, the quiet sense of being here that settles over the mind when everything else has dimmed. It doesn't feel like grounding, and it doesn't feel like introspection. It feels more like the mind gently acknowledging itself, without pressure, without effort, without needing to interpret anything that passes through it. This awareness doesn't arrive suddenly. It builds in thin layers, each one adding a faint density to your inner space. You sense it first as a slight deepening, a shift in how the mind feels against itself, as if something inside has lowered just enough for you to notice the new texture. It isn't intensity, it's presence, a soft, steady presence that neither expands nor contracts, but simply rests. As the night settles around you, this awareness spreads. It doesn't spread outward. It spreads inward, filling the mind with a low, even tone. Thoughts drift across this tone the way small objects drift across a calm surface. They don't disturb the awareness, and the awareness doesn't alter them. Both exist at the same gentle volume, neither one overpowering the other. This balance creates the soft weight, a sense that your mind has enough substance to hold what appears, but not enough to hold it tightly. You may begin to feel that awareness has a temperature, though not in a physical sense, more like a mild warmth or coolness that sits beneath your thoughts, a tone you can't quite describe but recognize instantly. It remains consistent even as your thoughts change. Whether a thought is light or unclear or brief, the awareness beneath it stays the same. That steadiness is what makes the weight feel soft rather than heavy. It holds everything evenly. This soft weight changes your relationship with your thoughts. Instead of feeling like distinct events happening inside you, they feel like small ripples moving across a larger surface. You sense them, but you also sense the wider field they're moving through. That field is calm. It doesn't react. It provides a gentle contrast that makes each thought easier to notice without being pulled into it. The awareness supports the thought without absorbing it. Sometimes this awareness feels like a light settling, as if your mind, which spent the day scattered in 1,000 directions, is finally returning to one position. Not a focused position, not a concentrated one, just a centered one. A position where nothing is being held up, nothing is being pushed forward, nothing is being braced for. The mind simply stands where it is, and that standing creates the soft weight. You may also notice that the awareness doesn't ask you to do anything with it. It doesn't ask you to examine yourself. It doesn't ask you to calm down. It doesn't ask you to feel peaceful. It just exists, indifferent to intention. It holds its shape whether you engage with it or not. That neutrality is what makes it gentle. Because the awareness isn't trying to be anything, it gives you space to exist without purpose. In moments like these, thoughts lose their pressure. Even if they carry traces of earlier concerns, they lose the urgency that once attached to them. They drift through the soft weight, touched by it, slowed by it, but not altered by it. The weight doesn't dismiss them. It doesn't diminish them. It just creates an environment where they can move without gaining momentum. They become lighter in your presence. You begin to sense a kind of internal balance that didn't exist during the day. Not emotional balance, structural balance. Awareness sits at the right distance from your thoughts. Not too close, not too far. It's steady enough for you to feel anchored, but soft enough that nothing feels rigid. This balance removes the need for the mind to adjust itself constantly. It lets thought rise and fall without resistance. As the night grows quieter, the soft weight becomes more noticeable. Not heavier, but clearer. It feels like a gentle pressure on the inside of your awareness, not pushing you down, but keeping you from floating away. It's the opposite of distraction, not focus, but presence. You feel yourself settling into the same slow rhythm as your thoughts, sharing a pace, sharing a level. In this state, even the act of noticing feels cushioned. You sense each thought through the soft weight rather than in front of it. The awareness filters, nothing judges, nothing encourages nothing. It simply exists beneath the movement, a quiet layer that supports everything without shaping it. Because of this, even the smallest internal shifts feel smoother. Eventually, the soft weight becomes the backdrop for the entire inner landscape. Thoughts move across it. Feelings brush against it. Awareness rests in it. It becomes the steady baseline that holds the night together inside you, a quiet density that keeps your mind from drifting too far or falling too deep. It keeps everything in place without effort. And as long as the night remains slow, that soft weight stays with you, not as a burden, not as a lesson, but as a gentle presence that lets everything inside you settle at the same low, even level. There is a way neutral thoughts begin to feel clearer when the night reaches its deepest stillness, not because they sharpen, and not because you're focusing harder, but because everything that normally competes with them has finally gone quiet. What remains are thoughts in their plainest form, simple, unembellished, carrying no emotional pressure and no narrative pull. They're the thoughts that spend most of the day hidden beneath stronger ones, overshadowed by noise, urgency, or momentum. When the night slows down enough, those neutral thoughts rise to the surface with a clarity that surprises you by how gentle it is. These thoughts don't announce themselves. They appear like faint outlines, minimal, steady, lightly shaped. Their neutrality is what makes them noticeable. Without emotion attached, they don't distort your attention. Without urgency, they don't try to lead you anywhere. They settle near the front of your awareness, like soft markers indicating that the mind is still moving, just at a pace that matches the quiet around you. You begin to sense that these thoughts were always present, but never visible. During the day, more charged thoughts take priority concerns, plans, reactions, intentions, expectations. They occupy the space where your attention naturally goes. But now, in this lower tempo, the mind allows its background layer to come forward, the layer made of observations with no weight, impressions with no direction, considerations with no purpose. They are thoughts without agenda. Their clarity doesn't feel crisp or bright. It feels clean. Clean, in the sense that nothing is attached, no history, no tension, no emotional residue. They exist as pure cognitive shapes, as if stripped down to the simplest version of themselves. A thought might appear, like this happened earlier, without trying to evoke a feeling. Another might appear, like this might need to be done eventually, without triggering planning. In the day, these same thoughts would have been absorbed into larger mental structures. Here, they stand alone. This clarity also brings a certain softness. Neutral thoughts don't intrude. They don't jolt. They don't sway your inner space. They drift in lightly and drift out just as lightly. Because they carry no emotional density, they move through your awareness without friction. You feel them as small shifts in the texture of your mind rather than as ideas. Their precision comes from their gentleness, not their strength. You may notice that the absence of emotion creates a cleaner internal environment. When a thought doesn't tug at you, your awareness can rest beside it instead of on it. You don't engage. You don't analyze. You simply acknowledge its presence the way you'd acknowledge a soft sound in the distance, recognizable but unobtrusive. This is why they feel clearer. Now there's nothing for them to compete with. As more neutral thoughts appear, your mind settles into a rhythm that feels level. There are no spikes of intensity, no dips, no shifts into narratives. Thought becomes a series of smooth impressions flowing at a pace that's easy to follow without effort. You sense each one distinctly because nothing is pushing against it. The mind isn't filtering or prioritizing. It's simply allowing. Neutral clarity also changes how you experience transitions. One thought fades smoothly into the next without interrupting anything. The space between them is even. You don't feel yourself shifting from one idea to another. It all blends into a single slow stream of light mental content. If daytime thinking is made of peaks and valleys, this is made of soft slopes, gentle, unbroken, consistent. Sometimes these neutral thoughts come with a faint sense of recognition, not emotional recognition, but structural recognition, the quiet awareness that this thought exists without needing to know why. You understand its presence without needing to understand its meaning. That kind of recognition feels clean too. It creates no internal echo. It leaves no trace. This state also reveals something about your mind that you may not notice otherwise. Much of its activity is neutral. Most thoughts aren't meaningful or charged. They're simply small internal signals that get overshadowed by louder ones. When the loud ones fade in the night, the neutral signals rise to become the dominant layer. And with that shift, you see the mind in a more unfiltered natural form. The clarity here isn't the clarity of insight. It's the clarity of low interference. When nothing distorts the thought, no emotion, no urgency, no expectation, the thought becomes what it truly is, a small passing formation. And seeing it as such creates a surprising sense of calm that doesn't come from quieting the mind, but from seeing the mind's quietest parts. As the night deepens, this neutral clarity grows smoother. The mind becomes a field where each thought lands softly, stays lightly, and leaves cleanly. You feel as though you're drifting alongside them rather than thinking them. You sense without participating. You remain open without effort. Eventually, the entire inner space takes on the tone of neutrality. It isn't dull, and it isn't blank. It's lightly illuminated, a soft brightness, where everything is visible, but nothing is emphasized. In that brightness, neutral thoughts glide through with a clarity only the slowest hours of the night can reveal. There are moments in the night when the mind begins to feel like it's settling back into its original shape. Not a better shape, not a calmer one, simply the one it naturally holds when it isn't being stretched by the demands of the day. It happens slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if each layer of tension loosens one grain at a time. Nothing snaps back. Nothing shifts abruptly. The mind just eases into itself, moving from the elongated pace of daytime thinking into something rounder, softer, more aligned with its own rhythm. During the day, the mind stretches constantly. It stretches to meet expectations, to handle conversations, to manage tasks, to adapt to situations that require speed or precision. It stretches to anticipate, to respond to, organize, to interpret. That stretching becomes so normal that you stop feeling it. It becomes the default posture, slightly extended, slightly braced, slightly ahead of itself. But when the night slows enough, that extension begins to unwind. You can sense the mind retracting from its forward-leaning stance, letting go of the small internal pulls that kept it taut. The feeling isn't one of release, but of returning. A kind of quiet settling that lets you sense the difference between the mind you use to move through the world and the mind that exists underneath all of that movement. As this process unfolds, the inner texture softens. Thoughts no longer arrive with any sharpness. Their edges lose the definition created by pressure. They stop trying to move quickly enough to match the pace around them. Instead, they flatten into gentle shapes that carry just enough form to be recognized. Each one fits more naturally into the space it occupies, no longer stretching to become something else. You may begin to notice that the mind feels more cohesive. During the day, different parts of your awareness operate at different speeds. Attention, rushing memory, lagging reactions, firing quickly, reflections forming slowly. But in this slower night rhythm, everything settles into the same tempo. The scattered parts fall into place. Awareness and thought feel like they belong to the same movement rather than competing ones. This cohesion doesn't create clarity, it creates evenness, an internal alignment where nothing moves faster than anything else. The mind stops fragmenting itself. It stops preparing. It stops managing. It simply rests in its own shape, the way an object does when the force pulling on it is finally removed. The mind isn't pulled or pushed, it just is. In this state, the smallest mental motions feel smoother. A faint impression might rise and fall without causing any disruption. A vague thought may pass through without gaining structure. A simple memory might surface without activating anything around it. Everything moves at a pace that fits the mind's natural contours, which are much slower and softer than the pace of the day ever allows. This return to shape also reveals how much unnecessary tension the mind accumulates over hours of activity. Not emotional tension, but structural tension, the tightening that comes from being constantly engaged. When that tension dissolves, you feel the absence of subtle strain you didn't even know you were carrying. The mind feels wider, but not in a spacious way. Wider in the sense that nothing inside is being compressed. Another part of this shift is the disappearance of internal resistance. During the day, some part of the mind is always resisting something: noise, pace, expectation, stimulation. At night, when nothing pushes against you, that resistance fades. With it goes the friction that normally sits between you and your thoughts. They move freely, unimpeded by the mind's defenses. You sense this as a soft smoothness beneath everything. As your mind continues settling into its natural shape, you may notice that the boundary between thought and awareness feels thinner. Not because thought becomes stronger, but because awareness stops holding itself apart. The two begin to share the same space, the same tone, the same level. A thought appears, and awareness meets it seamlessly, without the usual gap or adjustment. This creates a low, even hum, the mind functioning without effort. The absence of stretching also changes your sense of time. Without the need to anticipate or react, time stops feeling like something you're moving through. It becomes flatter, steadier. Moments feel similar in tone, blending together gently. Thought doesn't build toward the future. It doesn't lean backward into the past. It stays close to the present without trying to hold on to it. Eventually, the mind's natural shape becomes unmistakable. You feel it in the way thoughts drift instead of travel. You feel it in the way awareness rests instead of scans. You feel it in the way inner space remains even with no tightness at the edges. This is the mind without compression, without pace, without the extra layers it wears during the day. It's not a special state. It's the baseline, the quiet form underneath everything else. And as long as the night remains slow enough, the mind stays here in its own shape, unforced, unstrained, moving lightly through itself in the way it was meant to, when nothing demands more than this gentle settling. There is a moment in the night when the momentum you carried through the day begins to loosen in ways you don't immediately feel. It doesn't fade all at once. It doesn't dissolve cleanly. It simply starts letting go, layer by layer, like something that no longer has the energy to keep moving at the speed it once did. You don't notice it at first because momentum rarely announces itself when it leaves. It slips away quietly, leaving a softer space behind. During the day, momentum builds without your awareness. Every task, every conversation, every shift of attention adds a small amount of speed to the mind. Even when you're not rushing physically, the mental current keeps flowing forward, propelled by expectation habit and the subtle pressure to keep pace with everything around you. That momentum doesn't disappear just because the day ends. It lingers, carrying traces of urgency, traces of focus, traces of the push that kept you aligned with the world. But when the night slows far enough, the momentum begins to lose its grip. You sense it first as a slight change in the internal rhythm, the mind no longer moving ahead of itself, the thoughts no longer arriving with the faint shove that daytime pace gives them. It's as if something inside has finally realized there's nothing left to keep up with. The invisible engine winds down. As this happens, your thoughts stop leaning forward. They sit more softly in your awareness, not because they're clearer, but because they're no longer riding on leftover motion. They appear without acceleration. They fade without deceleration. They simply arrive, exist, and vanish all at the same slow level the night provides. You may begin to notice the absence of subtle internal pushes, the small impulses that normally drive your thinking from one idea to the next. Without momentum, these impulses quiet. A thought appears, and instead of propelling you into the next thought, it remains still. It doesn't create a chain. It doesn't create direction. It has nowhere to go because nothing is pulling it forward anymore. This shift feels strangely smooth. It doesn't feel like stopping. It feels like drifting into a gentler current. The mind doesn't fall silent. It falls into its own pace, a pace that matches the quiet around you, a pace that doesn't require effort to maintain. You aren't slowing the mind the night is. As the momentum continues to fade, you may sense how much of your internal strain was tied to speed rather than content. Thoughts that felt heavy earlier now feel softer simply because they're no longer carried by force. Concern loses its edge. Planning loses its urgency. Even memory loses its stickiness. What remains is the light shape of the thought itself, moving at a speed that isn't high enough to create tension. This shift creates a kind of gentle neutrality. You don't feel pulled toward anything. You don't feel pushed by anything. Thought flows because it's natural to flow, not because it's being driven. You're no longer reacting to an internal current. You're floating with it, carried by the same rhythm that's carrying your awareness. As momentum lets go, the space between thoughts becomes easier to feel. The gaps widen slightly, not into silence, but into a soft pause that doesn't demand anything from you. These pauses feel like the mind resting between movements, a rest so subtle you only notice it because nothing is rushing to fill it. Each pause is smooth, even and unbroken, blending seamlessly into the next thought that rises. You may also sense a change in how your mind holds itself. Earlier in the day, momentum keeps everything slightly tightened: attention, memory, focus, anticipation. But here, without that forward motion, the mind loosens. It stops bracing. It stops preparing. It stops predicting. All the subtle micro adjustments that used to shape your thinking fade into stillness. This stillness isn't silence. It's simply the absence of internal force. Without force, thought takes on a different tone. It becomes softer, wider, more fluid. It no longer hits you in bursts. It moves in long, slow waves that never crest. You notice these waves not because they are strong, but because they are gentle enough to feel their shape. As the last traces of momentum fade, you begin to feel the mind settling into a more natural position, one that doesn't tilt forward or backward, one that doesn't anticipate or recall. It becomes level, balanced, resting in the present, not as an intention, but as a default. The night provides the conditions, and the mind simply follows. Eventually, the momentum becomes so thin that thought loses its sense of direction entirely. This is not emptiness. It is not stillness. It is something softer, a mind no longer carrying the weight of movement. Thoughts drift slowly, without urgency, without expectation, without the subtle force that makes them feel heavier than they are. In this state, the mind feels closer to its baseline, quiet, unhurried, unpushed. Everything becomes lighter, not because anything has changed inside you, but because the momentum that once held everything in motion has finally let go. And in that letting go, the mind finds the pace it was always meant to have when nothing demands more than drifting gently through the slowest part of the night. There is a point in the night when everything inside you begins to feel level, not elevated, not lowered just even. It's the moment when the mind is no longer being stretched by the pressure of the day or pulled by the softened drift of earlier hours. You arrive at a place where your awareness and your thoughts almost meet in the middle, moving at the same quiet speed, occupying the same space without friction. Nothing inside you is ahead or behind. Nothing is tugging. Nothing is resisting. It's a rare kind of internal balance that only appears when the world is slow enough for the mind to fall into alignment with itself. This evenness doesn't feel like calm or peace. It feels more like neutrality, a stable middle point where nothing needs to be adjusted. During the day, the mind is constantly correcting itself, shifting attention, redirecting thought, managing reactions. Even at night, earlier in the slowing, things rise and fall in uneven patterns as momentum fades and filters loosen. But here, in this deeper phase, those adjustments dissolve. Everything inside you reaches the same soft tone. When you reach this level, thoughts appear without rising above the background. They don't stand out, and they don't sink. They arrive as if they're resting on the same plane as your awareness. Their presence feels equal to the space they move through. They're noticeable, but not highlighted. Felt, but not emphasized. You don't meet them with intensity or detachment. You meet them with the same evenness they carry. This creates a sensation that's difficult to describe because it doesn't feel like anything happening to you. It feels like something that has stopped happening. The subtle internal fluctuations you didn't realize were there throughout the day, small spikes of focus dips, of distraction, rises, of reaction, all flatten out. The landscape inside becomes consistent. Thought and awareness share the same altitude. You may begin to sense that in this state, your thoughts are no longer layered. Earlier in the night, they arrived in waves or drifted in thin currents. Some felt closer, others further. Here those distinctions fade. Every thought occupies the same distance, the same softness, the same immediacy. They don't compete. They don't overlap. They don't separate. They coexist as parallel movements in a quiet field. This parallel movement makes everything feel easier. You don't need to lean toward any thought to understand it, and you don't need to pull away from any thought to avoid it. Awareness sits evenly beneath everything, supporting each movement with the same quiet presence. That presence feels smooth, not soothing, not numbing, but smooth in a way that removes all internal friction. As the mind settles into this balance, the sense of self inside your thinking also shifts. You're not in front of your thoughts, and you're not behind them. You're beside them, sharing pace, sharing space. You're not chasing, following, resisting, or shaping anything. You're simply existing alongside whatever arises. This shared level creates a kind of quiet companionship between you and your mind, gentle, unobtrusive, almost transparent. This evenness also affects the texture of time. Without spikes of urgency or pockets of distraction, moments begin to feel uniform, blending into one another softly. There's no sense of moving forward. There's no sense of falling backward. Time flattens into a continuous, steady presence, and your mind floats through it rather than stepping through it. That floating feels natural in a way that daytime thinking rarely allows. You may realize that this state is neither deep nor shallow. It's just consistent. Thoughts don't dip into heaviness, and they don't rise into clarity. They stay level. Awareness stays level. Everything matches. This matching feels like a quiet alignment, not the result of effort, but the result of nothing pushing or pulling anymore. In this balanced space, even the act of noticing loses its distinction. You're not aware that you're noticing. You're simply present with what appears. Thought and recognition happen in the same instant without separation. Awareness is no longer an active process. It's an ambient one. It fills the moment without trying to do anything. Eventually, this evenness starts to feel like a backdrop, a wide open field in which thought moves without disturbing the ground it touches. The field doesn't shift. It doesn't tighten. It doesn't react. It holds everything at the same level, giving you a sense of stability that comes not from stillness, but from the absence of internal variability. And as the night continues, you remain in this aligned state, a place where nothing inside you stands out, nothing weighs down, nothing rises above. You and your thoughts move together gently and evenly, sharing the same quiet space in a way that only happens when the world is slow enough for the mind to become perfectly level with itself. There is a final quiet the mind reaches at the deepest part of the night, a quiet that doesn't feel like silence, doesn't feel like emptiness, and doesn't feel like the end of anything. It feels more like a soft settling, a gentle dimming of the last few internal movements that were still drifting through you. Nothing stops. Nothing closes. Things simply become lighter, slower, less defined. The mind slips into a state where every thought, no matter how small, begins to fade at the same gentle pace as the night around it. This quiet isn't sudden. It doesn't arrive as a drop. It comes as a gradual thinning thought, becoming lighter awareness, becoming softer, the boundaries between movements becoming almost transparent. Earlier in the night, thoughts drifted in loose shapes. Now they drift in barely their traces. A faint beginning, a faint shift, a faint fading. Each one barely forms, before dissolving back into the wide, low hum that holds everything together. You may notice that the mind stops producing new movement, not because it has run out of things to say, but because the conditions for thought to fully form are no longer present. The pace is too slow. The quiet is too wide. The internal space is too soft to give anything enough shape to develop. What appears now is closer to impressions than ideas, small pulses of awareness that rise just enough to be sensed, then blend back into the surrounding stillness. Awareness itself becomes less defined. It doesn't focus or gather. It doesn't try to follow or hold. It floats gently, almost detached from the need to engage. It remains present, but in the lightest way possible. A presence that doesn't move toward anything, doesn't rise for anything, doesn't try to stay alert. It simply sits lowered to the same dim tone as the thoughts it contains. In this state, the mind feels like a single continuous field. Thought drifts inside it, but nothing stands out. Everything is equally soft, equally subdued. Even the internal transitions, the shifts from one impression to another, become smooth to the point of invisibility. You don't feel yourself shifting between thoughts. You feel yourself drifting along with them, as if you and the movement are part of the same quiet current. The softness here isn't comforting in a warm sense. It's comforting in a neutral sense, a natural quiet that exists because nothing inside you is trying to do anything anymore. The mind has dropped out of planning, out of remembering, out of anticipating, out of adjusting. It's not empty. It's unengaged. And in this unengaged state, thought no longer needs to form fully. Partial shapes are enough. Soft traces are enough. The night doesn't require more from you. You might sense that even the idea of thought becomes less distinct. The mind produces small movements that feel more like gentle shifts of awareness than actual thinking. A tone rises, then falls. A vague recognition appears, then dissolves. A whisper of something familiar drifts by without forming a memory. These motions don't disrupt anything. They barely register as events. They're simply the mind maintaining the softest level of activity it can without falling silent. This final quiet feels like the mind folding inward, not closing, but settling into its lowest, most effortless mode. You're not entering an altered state. You're entering the mind's baseline when nothing stimulates it, nothing asks for it, nothing pulls on it. It's a mode the day never allows, and even the earlier hours of the night only hint at. Here in this final slowing, the mind rests in its gentlest texture. As you drift deeper into this state, you may notice how natural it feels. Not profound, not unusual natural. As if this is the mind without all the noise motion, and shaping it carries for the sake of moving through the world. A mind reduced to its simplest form, soft, slow, lightly aware, drifting without direction. Eventually, thought becomes so faint that it blends seamlessly into the quiet beneath it. You're no longer following anything. You're no longer meeting anything. You're simply sharing space with a kind of internal hush, a hush made of tiny dissolving movements, each one fading before it ever asks you to notice it. And as long as the night stays slow, this quiet remains a final gentle drift at the edge of thinking, the place where thought doesn't end, but becomes small enough to feel like part of the stillness itself.